We've recently been doing a short series on Galatians, and last week we looked at how Paul proved his authority. In the end, Paul's proof lay in his message in the way that it actually changed the life of people, so that they could know God in a radically new way, not through the Jewish rituals, but through Jesus Christ. And the outcome of Paul's work was that people glorified God because of it. And this, more than anything else, needs to be the criteria that we use today. In everything we do we glorify God? Because if I was a great preacher and people came from far and wide to come and hear me because of my eloquence and humour and depth and interest, but they didn't glorify God, but I got a personal buzz out of it, that isn't the goal. In our lives, the things we do, from chatting to our neighbours, helping someone, or whatever we do, at the back of our mind, we need to ask ourselves, are we glorifying God? Or do we want to have, for example, some sort of personal recognition? You know, a thanks wouldn't go amiss every now and then, or the work I do around the place. Church never says anything about what I do, that sort of thing. Why do we do what we do? Personal recognition or to glorify God? When we read in Galatians, Paul finally has a meeting with the leaders of the Jerusalem church, Peter, James and John, the pillars of the early church. And they were discussing what does it mean to be part of the church, and they were just talking about circumcision. And Paul was ministering to the Gentiles, and they agreed that they didn't need to be circumcised. In fact, the only thing they wanted Paul to focus on was to remember the poor. Interesting. There's no great theological treaty to be signed, no memorandum of agreement that took weeks to work out. Just remember the poor. But then we read of Paul confronting Peter when he comes to visit him in Antioch, north. Peter was eating with the Gentiles until some Jews from Jerusalem came, and Peter separated himself from the Gentiles. And this was unacceptable to Paul. But this was a Jewish rule. You didn't eat with Gentiles. But Paul was saying that this isn't the gospel that he now preaches. So the issue is this: how are we supposed to live even today? What are we supposed to do as Christians? What is the right way to live? Should I do this? Should I do that? How do we understand the gospel? This was a huge issue, but we have, for Peter and Paul, but we've had 2,000 years to say, well, we don't have to do the Jewish things now. But there are still things for us as Christians to say, what do we focus on? We come to our section that we read this morning where Paul clearly says that we are not justified by the law, but by faith in Christ Jesus, and we can accept that. However, we need to realise that faith is not simply a mental construct. It isn't simply what we say we believe, what we say we think. Faith is seen in the way that we live. Just like Peter's actions when the Jews arrived, his faith dictated the way that he acted. And faith directs every action of our life. Even today, when we got a glass of water, we had faith that the water would be clean. We didn't go through some sort of chemical process to check it, to see if it was clean. We just sort of drank it. When we drove or walked here today, we had faith that the cars would stay on their side of the road or off the footpath. Even when we sit here in the cathedral, we have faith that the ceiling isn't going to fall down on us. Otherwise, we probably wouldn't be sitting here, would we? So we do have faith in many things. It directs the way that we live. And in exactly the same way, our faith in God that Paul talks about dictates our life. The things we say, the things we do. How and what we believe about God. Now in verse 15, it uses the word sinner. But the idea of the word sinner here is those who didn't do the Jewish religious practices, rather than a more general term of sinners. All have sinned and fallen short. These sinners are people who didn't do the religious rules or the regulations expected of them by Jews. And this is important because many Jews thought that by doing these practices rightly made them right before God. And in such a way, they could actually boast about their justification. We're better than you because we do this and you don't do that or this. And it seems that this was seeping into the Galatians church. However, Paul follows this by reminding them that they are not justified through the law in any way, but through the grace of God. And so the issue here is, if believing in Christ doesn't mean that we no longer need to follow the law. In other words, does Christ allow Jews to be sinners, those who don't practice the law? And Paul actually says no. So here is my important point that I want you to think about. See if you agree with me. It's okay if you don't agree with me. I may be wrong. But in verse 20, Paul makes this observation that obeying the law made people think that they were right. Made them think that their ability made them right before God. Obedience to the law meant justification, which seems fair enough because in the Old Testament we were told again and again to obey the law. But the problem with this is that it created a degree of pride and prejudice, which is fair enough because people were obeying the law. And this is the point. Even though they were obeying the letter of the law, they weren't reflecting the nature of God. They were still getting things wrong. The law of God reflected the nature of God. And if people could still abuse the poor, ignore the needy, become proud, self-centered, arrogant, at the same time as they were obeying the law, they were getting it wrong. And it can be exactly the same question we can ask ourselves today as a church. Does our faith reflect the nature of who God is? What do people see in us? Paul's answer was for them to see the significant transformation that took place, reflected in his own very life. When he had his encounter with Jesus, it changed his life completely and continued to change his life throughout his journeys. And so Paul could say, it is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. This is a massive reality shift. It is no longer about the individual as such. It becomes about God's grace working in our lives. It's no longer about our inherent ability to be justified. It is about God working in our life. It changes everything. What we fight about, what we complain about, what we get angry about, what we laugh at. God working in us. God works for us, bringing in God's kingdom on earth as in heaven. And then there's this throwaway phrase that we could so easily jump over, where Paul says, "The Son of God who loves us and gave himself for us." This is the basis of our faith, the love of God for us. He gave himself for us. This is the basis of our faith. It is love, it is self-sacrifice. This is the motivation, the reason behind why we have faith. God's incredible love for us, who sacrificed everything for us. It changes who we are. And it continues to change who we are, even when we don't like it, even when we fight because we want to do what we want to do. You know, when Christ died on the cross for us, something changed in the universe, and no one can put their finger on it. The only way we can begin to understand it is in the sense that we now have the potential to know the reality of God in our life. And it is a real difference, a life-changing difference. And it is something that cannot be substituted by religious rituals or pious practices. It is something that comes from within a person. When we read about what Paul talked about justification, he's really talking about a faith that changes us completely because of God's love for us. God who gave everything for us. And it enables us to fulfill our two greatest commandments: to love God and to love others. Amen?